Hi, I'm Gary Bowerman, Director of Check-in Asia based in Kuala Lumpur.
And I'm Yereth Jansen, a Dutch entrepreneur based in Shanghai.
And today, Yereth and I are launching a new partnership that will deliver travel and tourism consulting, training, and thought leadership content from China and across Asia Pacific. We'll be launching a new brand shortly and rolling out some compelling travel and tourism projects over the coming months. So, Yereth, you've been working in the travel and consulting space for many, many years with international tourism authorities such as the UNWTO. You work with the China Advertising Association as the Deputy Secretary General of the International Communications Committee, and frequently deliver keynotes and training sessions in both Chinese and English. But Yereth, I don't think you get to use your own native tongue too often, do you?
Not that often indeed. Gary, you've been in Asia for even longer, haven't you? Since 2003, including 6 years in China. So Gary is the Asia Travel Analyst for Phocuswright and an Asia Consumer Trends Analyst for Mintel, as well as the author of 2 books and various reports on Chinese tourism. In addition, you're a regular conference speaker and media commentator on Asian travel developments. So you're keeping very busy.
Yeah, we're both keeping busy, Yereth. So together, we will be producing a regular, insight-rich video chats addressing key issues in travel and tourism in China and across the Asia-Pacific region. But to kick off, we're going to ask a single question. What did we really learn from China's October Golden Week? We've put together a list of 5 primary takeaways to analyze over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. 4 of those takeaways relate to domestic travel in China, which are the key focus of the Golden Week, and 1 relates to outbound travel. So before we start, Yereth, let's look at some of the key statistics from the 8-day National Day holiday, which ran from the 29th of September through the 6th of October.
So to start, domestic excursions soared to 826 million trips, which is up 71.3% from 2022 and a modest climb of 4.1% from 2019.
Yeah, there was a resounding 753.43 billion RMB in domestic tourism revenue. That dwarfs 2022's figure by 130%.
Train travel was a hot ticket with a 124% rise in high-speed train bookings.
Air travel was also very robust, 14.22 million passengers across the holiday period, a 7% increase from 2019. Overall, for the full 2023 year so far, domestic air capacity in China is up 6% from 2019, but international capacity is a long way behind, 64% down on 2019.
And car rental orders revved up by an astounding 4.6 times compared to 2019.
Yeah, self-drive travel is certainly one of the hot topics over the past 3 years or so. So yeah, let's start by looking at our 5 key takeaways. And the first one, I think, is a really, really important takeaway that perhaps maybe people around the world haven't logged on to so much. And when it relates to domestic tourism, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that the Chinese know how best to market to the Chinese, but not just in tourism.
Not just in tourism, no. What we see is we see this across the board with brands and products, and also obviously in the tourism market, especially after 3 years where China was very isolated. Those were 3 years where I haven't left the country, actually 4 years in total. And in that time, a lot has changed, actually. Obviously, there's been a lot of growth in social media trends, and in those few years, people have really started focusing on their own market. So in these 3 years, people were not traveling abroad. We very often were not even able to travel within China due to COVID outbreaks and some unfortunate lockdowns that most people are very familiar with, I think, in the international news. But that did cause a big shift. And what you also see is because of that internal focus, that the Chinese have gotten better at marketing anything really to themselves. We have seen in the past as well that some travelers, for example, if they wanted to go to sunny beach resorts, that they would prefer to go to Hainan over Southeast Asia because the language and the service is just closer to home and more familiar for a lot of people that don't speak English or are not familiar with international trends. But this has really ramped up a lot in the last few years. And that makes it a lot harder to compete with the local market in China as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen here so far this year, this expectation that the international outbound market from China would happen quite quickly, just wasn't really possible when you really look at how the Chinese travel industry, particularly the OTAs, particularly the airlines, particularly the the tour operators, the travel agents, they had to really focus for 3 years on the China market. And obviously during that time, they learned new tricks and new treats to use social media, to use Chinese platforms very, very well to market to Chinese travelers. But then the turnaround of that, once China did reopen after 3 years, like you said, meant that, the entire business models, particularly for the OTAs, had focused inbound on China only. And it takes time for that to recalibrate into the international sector. And at the moment, as we're seeing, the focus is still on domestic travel.
Absolutely, Gary. So we've seen that as well during the Golden Week, where many Chinese destinations were completely overrun, which actually already brings us to the second topic of today, I would say. Because what is the reason behind this, right? Obviously, everything has been focusing a lot more inwards in the last few years. And you also see that through specific trends in the travel industry where things are getting very convenient for Chinese people and Chinese really moving at China speed. Competition is so fierce these days, and companies are popping up everywhere. Platforms are popping up. There's a lot of local brands these days that are competing with international brands. And you immediately can get to a 1.4 billion people market through modern social media. And that means that you're also immediately competing with 1.4 billion potential other people that may be setting up the same sort of business model as you just came up with. So that makes it a lot more competitive. And that's why you have to move with speed in China that is very difficult to match in other parts of the world.
Yeah, that segues very nicely into our second key takeaway, which we've both referenced there in our chat. And that's the incredible influence of Chinese social media, not only for travel, but for travel experiences and tourism spending. Now, this is one of the things I get asked about quite a lot when I'm speaking around the world, is that the Chinese social media system operates its own ecosystem. The technology system in China is very, very different to the rest of the world. And therefore, it's, I think, quite difficult for foreign destinations and travel and tourism operators who are outside of China, to fully understand how Chinese social media actually works for consumers and for travel consumers in China, but also how that actually influences how Chinese travelers and tourists think when they travel overseas, because it does operate in a very, very different way. There are their own platforms that have their own unique elements, their own unique functionalities. But the one thing that we can definitely say is that social media is by far and away the strongest platform for connecting, particularly with younger people, isn't it?
Touched on something that is essential actually in both directions, because within China, I often notice that even people in travel boards are not really aware of what the international social media landscape looks like. What they often believe in China that websites are no longer being used because nobody in China is using websites. But it's simply like a completely different ecosystem. And so there's a misunderstanding on both sides, right? And that is only that misunderstanding, or that gap between knowledge of each other's markets has only grown during the COVID years of the last 3 years. So what we see is that, for example, a social media platform, which is called Xiaohongshu, or Redbook, Little Red Book in English, is massively influential, especially in the tourism space. And Redbook actually started much later than Weibo did. Weibo is still around, but not as influential in the tourism space. You see that as soon as something gets really popular in Redbook through influencers, that people just all flock to the same destinations. And they may be new destinations, which we've seen as well in the last Golden Week. But even if it's a new destination and suddenly there's so many people traveling to these destinations, they still kind of overwhelm those places. And what it also means is that if you're not on these platforms, and that is especially true for international destinations, you miss out on so much of the discoverability for the Chinese market. I noticed this also when I was in Holland a few months ago with the president of the China Advertising Association, and we were looking for a place to eat nearby. Their go-to platforms were still platforms that are called Dianping or Meituan in China, which everybody is using to either order takeout, takeaway, or find restaurants to eat in. And if your restaurant is not highly rated on these platforms, you're probably going to get nobody, while the restaurant next door is they're queuing up for an hour because that's the hot place to go to. And you see the same thing happening when Chinese people are going overseas, that many people are still using those same platforms. So we may be using a lot of the Western platforms like Instagram, and obviously we don't really use Ctrip very much. We may be going to TripAdvisor instead. and many other platforms. The Chinese people, they don't really use them at all, except for like a very small part.
Yeah, and I think another interesting point, particularly about Xiaohongshu, Little Red Book, is just how fast travel influencer trends change and how much trendsetters are always looking for something new. For example, if you look at some of the trends that were on the platform during the May holiday, and then you look at some of the trends and the destinations and some of the experiences that were on the platform in the October holiday, only a few months apart, they were quite different. And it just shows you how dynamic and fast moving Chinese social media is. And I think for international travel marketers, that's quite interesting because we tend to think in the West a little bit in terms of seasonality of travel and that trends pertain over a longer period of time. But it's such a dynamic market in China that if you're really influencing or trying to market based on something that happened in May, by October, you're simply out of date.
What I also noticed is I stayed in Shanghai during the holiday. I didn't have the opportunity this time to go overseas, and I didn't really want to travel inside of China to compete with a billion Chinese on train tickets and flights and hotel rooms. So instead I stayed here. And honestly, most places I visited in Shanghai were empty. And I went to a place called Rockbund, which is right next to the Bund. And the Bund is one of the hottest destinations in Shanghai at any given time, and especially during Golden Week. And I was probably at about 100 meters distance and there was nobody there. Rockbund is newly renovated, beautiful buildings. It's just getting started. But because it has not trended yet on any of these platforms like Xiaohongshu and Douyin, only a few locals in Shanghai read about it on a WeChat article somewhere. So it just means that, in a space of 100 meters further, you can't really move. And there we just sit down and there's plenty of seats for us to get a coffee or get some lunch. So that's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, it really is. So that's 2 points down. Let's look at our third one. I think this is quite interesting because this brings together the points number 1 and points number 2 that we've been talking about, how Chinese marketing is so effective to the Chinese population, and also how social media is so important in travel. Now, our third key takeaway, it is high-speed railway and its prominent role in travel planning and destination access. Now, we really saw this particularly during the May holiday, and we've definitely seen an expansion of this during the October holiday. As we know, the high-speed railway network in China is the largest in the world. It connects virtually every city in China, every major city. It's fast, it's punctual, it's quicker sometimes than taking a flight because the flights, sometimes you have delays, those kinds of things. Also connected to Hong Kong now, not yet to Macau. The Chinese high-speed railway network is also starting to be connected to Southeast Asia. The China-Laos Railway opened in April. So I would say, Yereth, there's 2 things about this that I think is most interesting. One, it just increases the options for Chinese travelers to take short trips to wherever they want to go to, increases the flexibility and the seamlessness of travel. But also it's become very much a social media tool, hasn't it? You see so many young people producing videos actually on their journey to the destination that they're traveling to.
It's pretty impressive how they essentially went from 15 years time from having virtually no high-speed network to having the entire country being connected, most of it at least. I used to live in Yunnan, as you know, China's southwest, very popular travel destination, and it's all mountains. But these days, you can take a 2-hour train from Kunming to Dali, which is the capital city of the province, to a place where you normally have to cross a couple of mountains, more than a couple of mountains, and used to take 10-15 hours by bus. Obviously, throughout the years that's been reduced, but these days it's just 2 hours by high-speed train, and that's in a pretty far corner of the country if you come from Shanghai or from Beijing. And from Shanghai, there's so many cities that it takes an hour to get there. In an hour and 10 minutes, I'm in Nanjing, which is one of the old capitals, and in 45 minutes I can be in Hangzhou, which is many Chinese people think it's the most beautiful city in China. And I think I could agree with that. So it's very convenient, and that convenience also means that everything else becomes more cumbersome to get to and is just further away. And also the means of buying these tickets and traveling there and getting everything arranged becomes more complicated. And that's mostly because everything's so convenient once you're inside of this ecosystem in China. And it's convenient for the locals. It's pretty convenient for me being here for so many years. But actually, it's pretty difficult for international travelers who want to come to China because you have to register for everything. I'm all set up, but obviously tourists would not be. But it also means that when Chinese people go overseas, they suddenly cannot use all of these tools anymore. Like some of them will still work. You can still book and Ctrip. You can still book your flights and hotels. But then there's a lot of other things that get disconnected. What do you think?
And you're right. 15 years has been the change has been astonishing, and the acceptance of high-speed rail into the daily infrastructure of travel and tourism. And I remember, Yereth, going back to 2008 during the Beijing Olympics, I rode that first high-speed rail line that China had introduced between Beijing and Tianjin. It was about a 30-minute ride. It was the first high-speed railway. It was very, very popular. It was a tourist attraction. But at that time, there was still a lot of skepticism about whether a national network was possible and whether people would actually warm to it, because domestic flying at that time was really, really taking off. But over 15 years, this network is incredible. And it is now, I would say, during the golden weeks, it's difficult to get tickets on key lines, isn't it? It's popular, it's overbooked, it's easy to book, you book with your mobile phone. But I think this interesting thing of actually taking in-train videos, which has become such a hot topic on the social media platforms, just shows you that the journey now is as important as actually arriving.
Yeah.
So let's move on to our fourth takeaway from the Golden Week, and this is quite an interesting one, I think, Yereth, because this really looks at the issue of seasonality of travel and over tourism in a very, very China-specific way. As we know, there are three key holidays in China, three public holidays when you have these huge migrations of travel and tourism around the country. Spring Festival early in the year, then you have the May holiday, and then the October Golden Week. And across this year, we've seen gradual progression, haven't we, in terms of numbers of people using the transport networks and traveling. Confidence seems to have rebuilt now. It was obviously a little bit weak in Spring Festival this year, started to develop in the May holiday, but October seems that the domestic travel season was one of the hottest that I would say China's probably ever had.
Yes. Yeah, of course, in the beginning of the year, we did see a big surge in tourism, but that was inevitable because there were so many restrictions in 2022. When there was the big lockdown in Shanghai, I spent about 4 months on the road, figuring out every single day from day to day where was allowed to travel, where there would not be any lockdowns. That was really complicated. So with China opening up so quickly in December, that also opened up the country, at least for Chinese people to travel during the first holiday, which is Spring Festival. But Spring Festival is also traditionally spent with family. So even though we saw a surge that kind of went on for a few more months, I think after that it calmed down a little bit because the economy was still recovering as well. And that's a whole different topic in itself. So you see a little bit of the revenge travel happening, right? Revenge spending, revenge travel, where people do want to get out for a few months and then realize that they do have to look at their budgets. May holiday was quite good, but this was definitely a record-breaking holiday for domestic tourism, and something that we'll get into in a little bit, not so record-breaking for outbound tourism in China. So what you see is that what we discussed earlier on social media, where destinations suddenly get this huge attention on different platforms, such as Douyin, such as Xiaohongshu, such as a few other ones, that a lot of places are dealing with over tourism. So I think everybody has seen the videos, the pictures during the first few days of Golden Week, where train stations were just crawling with people, people taking selfies on the Great Wall, saying that they've traveled for 2,000 kilometers to get there, and they basically can't even get on the wall because they're still waiting in line. Over tourism in China takes on very different scale than when we talk about over tourism in many other destinations. So that's mostly because you have a domestic market of 1.4 billion people, of which many are traveling during that time, and all at the same time as well. And that's something that is well out of proportion when we look at other destinations. So how to manage this over tourism, I think when these destinations learn, if they survive and they can cope with the Golden Week rush, then anything that happens outside of Golden Week is not going to feel like over tourism at all for anybody or anywhere in China. And I think that puts things in a different perspective in China, that they look at these problems in a different way. What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think when you stand back on it, I mean, I lived in China for 6 years, and Golden Weeks, when I lived there in the 2000s, were really, really important. Travel and tourism as a concept was still building. We sometimes forget that, travel and tourism is a young industry in China. It was only back in 2003. I remember it quite well. The individual Chinese travelers from the mainland could actually go to Hong Kong. It's that young. But it's the size of the market, as you said, the concentration of travel and tourism around these 3 periods around the year, which is why the whole world has so much interest in China's public holidays. It doesn't happen in any other country in the world. There's not so much interest in public holidays. But because the Chinese have these 3-week-long or 5-day-long holidays where it concentrates almost levels of travel and tourism that most other countries in the world can't really conceive, that's why it raises so much interest. And that brings us, I would say, through to another point, because we've been talking mostly, haven't we, about domestic travel and tourism, and the Golden Week in October really showed that the confidence to travel domestically is certainly there. The unblocking of that pent-up demand is definitely there. The travel services and suppliers have offered enough supply. There's plenty of train tickets, plenty of flight tickets. But when it comes to the international market, very different concept at the moment.
We've seen pretty low numbers in the recovery of international travel compared to 2019, because that's the year that really matters. And I think a lot of countries are perhaps a little bit disappointed in how many Chinese people have been traveling to their destinations, their countries, haven't they, Gary? And what is your view? Like, what does it feel like in Southeast Asia right now, and how are people looking at the Chinese market for their inbound market?
So I think the fifth key takeaway that we get from this Golden Week really is managing expectations in Chinese outbound travel. So if we go back to January the 8th of this year, when China started to reopen in a gradual and phased way, expectations, I think, around Southeast Asia were very high, that the travel and tourism outbound from China would basically go back to where it was before. I don't think anybody really perceived just how difficult those 3 years have been for not just for consumers, for people living in China, but also for the travel industry as well. So there were expectations that, there would be perhaps a slow start, but then it would start to ramp up. And that by this time of the year, October Golden Week, we would start to see considerable numbers traveling into Southeast Asia from China. Let's not forget that in 2019, 23% of all inbound visitors to the Southeast Asian countries came from China. So, it's almost a quarter of the market. Now, that hasn't happened. We know that the outbound recovery from China has been much slower. There are various reasons for that. But the primary reason at the moment is the number of flights. The outbound international air capacity from China is only around about 57% of where it was this time in 2019. So 57%, you could look at it glass half full or glass half empty. You could say it's way down on expectations. I think even industry players in China thought that it would be up above 65% around now. But then the other side of that, you say, well, there's still 43% of the market to come back. It does look as though we've had a progression over the year. More Chinese travelers are traveling, but not the same numbers as before. Is that market going to come back in full in 2024? Will it extend into 2025? There are some great unknowns, I think, in the outbound market from China this year. I think there are still expectations that we have seen basically the first recovery year, and the 2024 might be stronger, but not necessarily. In Thailand at the moment, there's huge gloom in Thailand. You may remember the actual Golden Week this year was overshadowed really by a tragic shooting at Siam Paragon Mall in central Bangkok. One Chinese national was killed, another one was injured. And that's really fed off some security fears about travel and tourism in Southeast Asia, which did exist actually before the Golden Week. There are a couple of movies in China looking at scams and personal security. And actually, this is an interesting statistic, Yereth, is that in the Golden Week in Thailand, less visitors visited Thailand during Golden Week than the previous week. Now, I think there are two real key takeaways from that I would like to wrap up with. One of those is that the Chinese market is still progressing in terms of its outbound recovery, and we shouldn't give up on it by no means, but you have to manage expectations. But I think the second one is really there is still too much focus in destinations around the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia, on the Golden Weeks. And actually, you should be looking at outbound travel from China across the year, because particularly the higher spending independent travelers don't tend to travel into the region during the Golden Weeks. They travel at other months of the year.
Absolutely. The higher income bracket in China, well, probably anywhere, are generally also people that will have a little bit more freedom in deciding when they can travel. You see that a lot of people in China simply do not have the ability to take time off work during the rest of the year, or take time off for a longer period of time. So that higher income bracket, I think, is the most interesting one for countries that are looking to recover their China market. And this is something that we can look at indeed, Gary. That's a good point. So that will be, I think, an important focus for 2024 as well.
Yeah. So as a wrap up, Yereth, I thought I would say 2023 in terms of Chinese tourism. If you're looking at from outside of China, if you're a destination or a travel and tourism business, there have been a huge amount of learnings. I think we've learned a lot about how the market is recovering in China this year, the scale and pace of that recovery, and what that might bring in 2024. But there are still a few great unknowns. Looking at it from inside of China, what will be your wrap up, Yereth?
I would say the most important thing is that markets that are looking at China as a source market for their tourism, that they also learn how the Chinese market is working right now, what the trends are among Chinese consumers, understand that the online ecosystem, the social media ecosystem is entirely different from the rest of the world, and understand this to the point that you need a local team, you need to manage this, you can't just wait until somebody shoots Lost in Thailand and brings all the tourists for you. I mean, you need to actively work on this and integrate that with the local methods that are being used. So localize for the market. It sounds simple, but it's something that is so essential, and it requires that people do first get a basic understanding of what it looks like, right? Even if it's just for choosing the right partners, choosing the right strategy. So this is, I think, a very important takeaway. We don't have much control over the other things. But what we can do is actively try and work in the market in a way that resonates with the local people.
It leads into a lot of what we'll be talking about and some of the work that we'll be doing over the coming months.
Yes, it does.
So that brings us to the end of this first video chat, looking at China and Asia Pacific travel and tourism, looking at some of the key issues, both now and forward thinking, and what we're looking forward to in 2024. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. You can find us both on LinkedIn, where you can send us your thoughts and your comments on anything that we discussed or anything that we missed out.
We'll be back next month with a new video chat discussing some hot trends in Chinese travel that will transfer into international tourism in 2024. If you have any questions, reach out to us in the comments, and hopefully see you next time.